So on the call, on this talk, Jonathan, we have not just our own people from the Center for Humans and Machines, but also people from the rest of the institute, Max Planck Institute for Human Development, who are interested in these topics. We've also got a few people from University or from the Toulouse School of Economics. Jean-Francois Bonnefond, who you may know, who's a big collaborator of ours, and his team, as well as the team that we're building here. So thank you for agreeing to give the talk and for agreeing to the invitation. We're all very excited to hear you and learn more about your work that we're familiar with. So for everybody else who is not familiar with Jonathan, he's basically like one of the godfathers of emotions in AI, like the computational modeling of emotions, and did this work way before it was super cool to do it now, as it is now. And he's also one of the first people, I would say, to do experimental behavioral science well within computer science. I would say there's a lot of kind of bad methods, if I may say so. And I think Jonathan is one of the people who collaborates across the spectrum with behavioral scientists and psychologists. I see Nate Fast's name here, for example, on the slide as an example. And I think Jonathan's work has been very influential. One example is, and really kind of counterintuitive, like there's a classic paper that I really like that shows how people would be more willing to disclose feelings and personal information in a health type of scenario if they felt like they were disclosing to a machine rather than a human. So it's for me, I like that result because it feels like we always think of machines as this thing that makes things cold and calculating and kind of logic-based and rational. But the fact that we can, in some scenarios, become even more emotional and trusting of machines because they're machines is a fascinating kind of result and opens up lots of interesting avenues. So, Jonathan obviously won lots of awards and was recognized for a lot of this work. I knew him from my days in the autonomous agents community. I used to go to AMAS, the Autonomous Agents and Multi-Agent Systems Conference. So I know I think we have lots of friends in common. And it's funny that we're kind of, I find myself now reconnecting with that, with people that I've met back then, because of our interests kind of evolved and converged again. So very excited to have Jonathan here today. And I'll hand over to you to present. Thank you, Jonathan, for joining us.
Yeah, and thank you for the very warm and thoughtful introduction. What I'm gonna, as you mentioned, a lot of my work is around emotion. I'm gonna talk about a particular line of research where emotion plays a role, but it's more implicit in the sense that emotion influences how we make decisions. And that, I suspect, underlies a number of the findings I'll talk about today, but I won't probably talk so much explicitly about emotion. And just to mention, so a lot of my work is very interdisciplinary. So this is a project, in particular, I'm working with Nathaniel Fast at USC. Nate is in the business school here and an expert in organizational behavior. And really this project is looking at the role autonomous agents are increasingly playing within organizations as organizational decision makers and how that might change how decisions are made and how people treat each other and so forth. So just to kind of start off, a lot of my work is really focused on human-machine interaction and, for example, the role of emotion in that. And so how do people treat the machine and how can we make the machine treat people? In the study that was just discussed about, for example, people might feel more comfortable disclosing mental illness to a machine because they don't fear being judged or evaluated, because one of the issues in those settings is people want to keep up a good impression. They don't want to admit weakness, but maybe it's okay to admit weakness if it's a machine. And we can look in that work about, to what extent do people trust machines and how can machines influence human behavior. But this project is really looking at the fact that, these machines are not really autonomous. In some sense, they represent the interests, the goals, the desires of some person or organization behind that machine. So for example, I don't know if you guys have Alexa in Germany, but if you're America, you're talking to Alexa, people often kind of feel like it's a thing unto itself, but really you're interacting in a sense with Jeff Bezos and his organization. And Jeff Bezos has controls over this thing and imputes his goals and desires into this artifact, which you're interacting with, but he's not necessarily salient. And so the question in this series of studies I'll talk about today is really, how does that, what we call autonomy-mediated interaction, influence the relationship between two individuals? And this talk about adopting some organizational literature, I'll refer to this as the principle, because of the person in some sense controlling the agent, and then the agent is interacting with some counterpart. And there's a lot of examples of this happening in the real world. So you may have heard the term algorithmic management. And so organizations like Uber, really what's happening there is you'll have some human marketing manager setting knobs on this autonomous system that then goes off and autonomously interacts with drivers and customers. And we could ask, how does that influence the relationship compared to a more traditional organization? And we're also seeing the rise of these kind of personal assistants. So Google alleges they have software that'll go off and negotiate the time and price of a haircut for you. And there's other software that tries to resolve disputes between people. And we could ask, how does that change the relationship to people compared to when you interact, say, with a barbershop directly or a disputant directly? And of course, the military is very interested in autonomous systems, autonomous weapon systems, other kinds of things. And one of the big focuses in that realm is that we can no longer afford to have people in the loop because the pace of things are so fast. Rather, it's human on the loop. And so you're increasingly seeing situations where people are tasking autonomy, which then more rapidly deals directly with other systems and even people. And we might ask, how does that influence the relationship? And questions in particular interested is, so how do people treat people through these agents? And specifically, might they show less ethical regard? Might they be more willing to accept risks when they act through these systems than when they act directly? So, for example, would that result perhaps in greater civilian casualties if people are interacting through these autonomous systems? And a second question is sort of how willing are people to cede authority to such agents, and what are the factors that might influence that decision to cede authority? Now, there's actually, in this project, we're drawing on quite a bit of existing research that speaks to this question, but speaks to it in a somewhat different context where the agent is a human. So you're probably familiar, at least in English, the term agent, which we use in computer science to refer to software. In the business world, it refers to people. You have real estate agents, and lawyers are agents that represent your interests. And so the question is, how within organizational research, how do having these intermediaries influence the decision-making process that organizations do? And one type of finding that's been fairly well supported is that when you put these agents in between people, it creates a certain kind of psychological distance. It makes people feel further apart, and that can lead to what Bazerman, for example, is called bounded ethicality. So you think less about the other, and so the other's feelings or interests are less accounted for in your decision making. And so broadly speaking, people tend to show less benevolence principals show less benevolence to counterparts through agents. They often act with less integrity, make riskier choices, and actually feel and, in fact, receive less blame from counterparts for their actions. So counterparts will tend to blame agents more than the person behind the agents. So this is consistent with the general idea of bounded rationality, that people don't look at the full part of information. And so in the social context, bounded rationality often means an inability to take these sort of multi-step inferences about blame and judgment. The question of willingness to cede authority to such systems, also there's a rich existing literature within organizational research around what's called principal agent theory. And the argument is that that this is often mediated by perceptions of trust. And so the more one trusts one agent, the more control we afford to them, more autonomy we afford to those agents. And you can also think of different types of trust. So Mayer's model emphasizes a distinction between benevolence-based trust and integrity-based trust, such that benevolence trust is the question of, does this agent share my goals? And to the extent we don't believe the agent shares our goals, we try to assert control over that agent. For example, by surveilling them or by creating financial incentives to ensure that their goals are more in line with us. Integrity-based trust is really the question of, does that agent share my ethics? And to the extent that we feel it doesn't, people enact what's called process control. And so these are more ways to coerce the means by which outcomes are obtained. And so again, that can be enforced on agents through various means. And so the research focus of this project I'm discussing is really these two questions of how is the ethicality of principles to counterparts influenced by the creation of these intermediaries, and then what factors do people use to control the agent's autonomy, and then how do those interact? But specifically, where we now replace the human agent with computer agents. So can we apply these same theories to give insights into this human-machine context? Now, the way we approach this experimentally is through a variety of methods. We do some surveys of hypothetical scenarios, but a lot of the work is to create essentially game-like decision tasks where we can have people engaged in real decision-making behavior and observe the decisions that they actually make. So I'll kind of broadly go through some findings. So first, one question you might ask is, how do counterparts treat principals when the principals are represented by agents? Do counterparts treat agents with less ethical regard and thus the principles they represent than if they interacted with those principles directly? And through a number of studies, we've identified some factors that shape the extent to which people behave ethically in these contexts. One seems to be how salient is the principle. So often when you're interacting with an agent, as I mentioned with Alexa, you don't necessarily think about the people behind that system. And so we tried to manipulate that experimentally. And one of the series of studies we looked at is we have people play dictator games. And so dictator game is a simple economic game where basically you're given an endowment of money and you have the opportunity to give some of that money, share some of that money with another. And of course, there's no cost to not doing it, but you often see experimentally that people get close to 50-50 of their endowment. And this is argued to be a measurement of other regard, to what extent you feel concerned for the other or guilty that you don't do your part to be fair. And so you can measure how much money do people give when they play another person versus how much money do they give when they play an agent that represents another person and gives that money to that person that they represent. Or what if we just say you're playing with a computer, or kind of as a manipulation check, we tell people, okay, this money will disappear and go into the trash. And you imagine they should give low in that case. And so in a sense, what we're doing with these different conditions is we're increasing the psychological distance to the other. We're making them, in some sense, less salient, but also more different than you. And what you see experimentally is that that has a clear effect on the amount of endowment people share with the other. And so people share close to 50% when they believe they're playing with another. That drops somewhat when that person is represented, and it drops significantly when the other is not salient in the situation. So that's kind of a measure that salience is important. We also have looked at characteristics of the agent to see how does the beliefs about the agent's capabilities, so there's some audio leaking through, it's distracting. How do characteristics of the agent people are interacting with influence this willingness to behave in an ethical way? And so one framework we've been looking at is mind perception theory. This is by Gray and Wegner, that argues that when we interact with others, we attribute mind to them. And that mind, broadly categorized, can be seen in terms of two dimensions. Do they have intelligence, and do they experience emotion? And broadly speaking, machines were willing to ascribe intelligence, agency to them, particularly if they're autonomous. And the more that one ascribes that, the more we kind of hold them accountable for their actions. And the more we ascribe feelings of emotion to the other, the more they merit protection from harm. And broadly speaking, people don't see machines as experiencing emotion, so they don't feel that they need to worry about hurting their feelings. But experimentally, if you add things like emotion to machines, what we see is people will in fact give more in these kind of games. So they show more other regard to the machine if either the machine shows it as emotion or they're told in advance that somehow it feels pain. So that's broadly saying that looking at how counterparts treat agents. For most of this talk, I'll look more at how principals treat counterparts and look at how different forms of control might influence that process. So let's look at one example, and let's look at where people are given the opportunity to have process control over agents. So remind you that process control is something that people want to do when they feel like the agent doesn't share their ethics. And there's various ways to do that. One of the domains we wanted to look at that is negotiation, because negotiation is a domain where questionable ethics do often occur. We've tried to buy a used car, you may have run into that. So negotiators often, lawyers and professional negotiations often are very comfortable using deceptive tactics, emotional manipulation. And there's research in the literature that argues that these tactics are in fact more prevalent when agents, intermediaries are involved. People are more comfortable with that. It's also a domain where we're seeing an exploding use of automation. And so automated negotiators are being created that can negotiate goods and services on the behalf of others. Here's one kind of recent example. Is a company called Trim that they have a little chat bot that'll actually contact companies like Comcast is a cell phone company, and will negotiate your terms of your agreement on your behalf. So one question that's sometimes raised in terms of ethics in these machine settings is really, who gets to set the ethics? Is it mandatory? Do governments, do companies require a certain ethical setting? Or some have argued, in fact, that people should have personal control over the ethical settings of these systems. And so that's what we went with. So the question was, what if you were given a set of ethical sliders where you could actually tell your agent, is it okay to be really tough? Is it okay to withhold information or to lie or to engage in emotional manipulation when you're engaged in a negotiation with others? So how do we actually do that? So we adopted a measure that's used in the negotiation literature called the SIN scale. It's basically it's called self-reported inappropriate negotiation strategy scale. It's a questionnaire that asks a series of questions to get at to what extent you're willing to engage in certain kinds of tactics that some would argue to be unethical. And those are broken into these 5 subscales. Hard bargaining is just being tough. Misrepresentation is lying explicitly, withholding information, manipulate use of emotion, both negative and positive. And so what we did is adapted that scale to, in an experiment, there were 2 conditions. Either we asked people ahead of time, would you do these things, which is how the scale is normally used. And the other condition, we asked people, we adapted those items to say, is it okay if your agent, for example, lies to your opponent about your goals and interests to strengthen your position? And so they answered these series of questions. The argument was the agent needs to get to know your interests and preferences. And so this is part of you specifying that, not just what you want, but how you want to get it. We also looked at experience because some evidence suggests that more experienced negotiators are more comfortable doing these unethical tactics. So this was a hypothetical study. So this first study 1 was we just wanted to see hypothetically, how would you act for yourself versus how would you want to act through an agent? And what we see is an effect such that there's a main effect of experience. The more experienced you are, the more willing you are to be deceptive. But we also see, particularly if for low experienced people, if you're not a very good negotiator, you want your agent to lie on your behalf more than you would do yourself. And so there's some evidence that people are more comfortable endorsing deception through these autonomous systems. Study 2, we actually had people engage in a negotiation either directly or through an autonomous system. And we're using here a system called Iago, developed by one of my PhD students. It's what's known as a multi-issue bargaining task. So there's different issues you can negotiate over. You can move things around to make offers. You can do information exchange. You can ask what you want, tell what you want. You can send emojis. And then what we had people do is they either negotiated directly with another person through this, or they could program their agent to negotiate on their behalf. And as part of that, they could program this ethics, and then they could watch their agent engage in the task. What we also, but again, found is the same thing. So generally, there's a main effect of experience. People who are record themselves as experienced negotiators are more willing to engage in deception, but those who feel uncomfortable negotiating would prefer their agents to lie on their behalf. So that, just to kind of summarize, is a series of studies looking at process control. If you can give these ethical knobs to an agent to change the manner in which they do their behavior, we find some evidence that this reduces the ethical behavior of how principals treat the counterparts that these agents interact with. So next, I'm going to have a series of studies that look at outcome control, which is not so much the means, but the ends to which these agents achieve. And this is sort of the more common way people think about guiding these kinds of systems. And so in this case, we again look at a variety of economic games. So for example, ultimatum game is like the dictator game, except that receivers get to reject offers. And so the amount that people send in this game can be seen as a measure of ethical regard. If you give closer to 50-50, that's sort of more fair, more ethical. If you keep more yourself, that's more selfish. And then whether you accept or reject can be seen as also a measure of how important is fairness. So if you reject unfair offers, that can be seen as a measure that you have greater concern for ethics, whereas if you just accept crappy offers, that suggests you're less focused on ethical principles and more focused just on getting something rather than nothing. And so we can look at, how do people program their agents to send, or how would they program their agents in response to certain fair or unfair offers. And so what we have people do is either play this game directly, or in advance, they program their agent as to what outcomes are acceptable. So what should the agent offer, and how should the agent respond to different types of offers it might receive from the counterparts. So they can either program their agent in advance to do this task, or they can play another person directly. And so what we find experimentally is when people believe they're playing another person, they make a certain offer. When they're making proposals to the other, they actually are less fair in direct interaction than they are when they interact through agents. So this is actually a reverse of what I showed before. So what we're seeing here in this series of studies where we're looking at outcome control is this reversal, that actually programming these agents' outcomes in advance leads people to apparently value fairness more than if they were interacting with a person directly. And we've seen this over and over again in a number of tasks where we've looked at this sort of outcome control. And so we have a series of studies in PNAS where we look, for example, at self-driving cars and your behavior as to whether you want to use air conditioning or not. The argument is framed around economic or environmental goal. Do you want to be good for the environment, or do you want to just get there fast or comfortably? And again, we see this phenomena where people using this sort of outcome control measure are more fair interacting through these representatives than they are when they're directly interacting with other people on the web. So at this point, we sort of have this puzzling set of results where with a series of studies where we have process control, it seems that principals are telling their agents to act less ethically, though through a series of studies where we're having people directly program the outcomes without discussing how those outcomes are achieved, we're seeing a fairly robust finding that people are acting more ethically through these kinds of systems. Now, there's a lot of confounds here that we haven't unpacked yet. So one thing is there's a big difference in kind of the level of abstraction. So when we're looking at outcome control, it's really, for the economists, we're using something called the strategy method. So people are really at a very low level specifying all the details of what the system is doing. When we're exploring process control up to now, it's at this very high level, and we're using these loaded terms. And so I think what we need to do is a lot more work to unpack the details of these interfaces, because it may just be something also about the way the interfaces are framed that are causing these effects. Now, just to transition to the second question of willingness to cede authority, we've also been doing a number of studies, and this is led up by Rajni Brindan, who's a former student in AFAS, who's now at UVA. And she's been looking at a series of studies on how these technologies might be used in the workplace. One question is related actually to this idea of, do people disclose more to computers? So within organizations, managers often want their employees to disclose honestly about how the organization is doing or how they're feeling. And so there's been interest in actually creating automation that will talk to people, chat with them, and find out, how they're doing and elicit information about the organization. And so she was curious about to what extent would managers and employees actually want to use this technology, and what were the factors that would influence their willingness to adopt it. And so she's been doing a number of scenario studies. The basic, very abstract findings we're getting out of here is that we're seeing that control seems to be a very important factor, so that managers want to have control over these systems, and they're very reluctant to use them in such sensitive settings, such as if they're eliciting feedback about themselves, but they're more comfortable using them in sort of operational settings where you're asking about the project or something. So the more the situation is emotionally salient to them, they actually would rather do it themselves and use this kind of autonomy. But another factor that seems very important is to convey benevolence to the employee. And so there's also a big concern as to whether this technology would actually be seen as communicating care to employees. Broadly speaking, also we find that managers are much more willing to adopt this technology than employees would want to be. And so there's an asymmetry between in terms of the power relationships within an organization as to willingness to adopt this technology. And in general, through some other studies, we've been finding that managers, when something is uncomfortable and they believe it can be handled, they're rather the technology do it than do it themselves. So another series of studies was looking at, do you want to give negative criticism to an employee, or would you rather have an agent do it for you? It seems that managers are more willing to have an agent do it for them. So kind of one of the tentative theoretical models we're looking at to pull this stuff together is we do think this control is essential in this relationship, in that this distinction between process and outcome control seems promising. And so broadly speaking, people want to control their agents when they don't trust them, but there's these different kinds of trust. But the more that they ascribe autonomy to these systems, it seems that it may increase the psychological distance, and so thus lead to less ethical behavior through these counterparts. So oddly, the more you trust these systems, possibly the worse you treat the people that these systems interact with. But this is would emphasize a very tentative model at this point. We've been playing with COVID. We've noticed COVID is screwing up all our studies because we do a lot of stuff online now. One of the things we've noticed in these studies, we started measuring COVID. Essentially, we adapt a PTSD scale to assess to what extent is COVID impacting people. And one of the things we've been observing in all these studies is that those people who report greater impact of COVID seem to be less discriminating. They treat humans and machines more similarly, and there also seems to be sort of a benevolence bias such that the more people are reporting impact of COVID, the more willing they are to give to others. And this is consistent with some findings about heuristic thinking. When people are under stress, they resort to sort of system one thinking, emotional thinking, which seems to have a sort of default pro-social bias. So just to say, if you're doing these kind of studies in the age of COVID, just be aware that COVID is causing an interesting influence over studies. So just to kind of summarize, I kind of introduced this idea of autonomy-mediated interaction and gave some evidence that it can alter ethical regard, but this, though we're seeing clear differences, the differences are not always consistent. In some situations, people are more ethical through these systems, in other cases less. It may have something to do with process versus outcome control, but we're not entirely sure. But at a high level, I think what this illustrates is the potential benefit of trying to apply organizational research to the design of these autonomous systems. And with that, I'm happy to take some questions.
Please, if anyone would like to ask some questions, please just go right ahead.
Hello, this is Shabnam. Well, thank you for your talk, John. So first I have to confess where I'm coming from: economics and statistics and engineering. And I'm listening to you, and you're telling me things about ethicality. And I don't understand the relationship between ethicality and prosociality. Are they the same thing? If you are more ethical in your measurements, are you also more prosocial? Also, I don't see the difference. If you can tell me how this relates, because you started with one of the terms that is very dear to us, principal-agent relationship. And we look at it and we say there is either information asymmetry or moral hazard. How is your ethicality different from what we call moral hazard. And finally, just a point. It was really interesting to me. I heard it for the first time that in dictator games, people also go for 50-50 split. It's usually in Ultimatum that they get close to that, from what I know. So I would love to see more literature on that.
It's more like 30% that we've been finding, but
And then have you considered the 1998 introducing a dummy into Ultimatum, which I'm talking about Van Damme Guth game, which was the first solid experiment on how fairness can come into labs. That's all. Thank you. I'm listening.
Okay. There's a lot of stuff. So can you read? I'm not familiar with the last paper you mentioned. So which one is that?
I'll send it to you. Yeah,
okay.
Sure. It's a 1998 Guth and Van Damme. Guth, was the original person who designed Ultimatum
Right.
in his labs. Yeah, and then they went through these ideas, and some psychologists were talking about the fairness considerations when the split was not predicted directly based on a zero-sum game. And they just introduced a third agent who was a dummy. He had no say. So kind of combining dictator with ultimatum, but then still the second agent gets to decide.
So this is the third party could actually decide whether to accept or reject the offer. Is
the second party decides. The third.
You cut out.
Yes.
The second party decides. The third party does what?
Just exist, can receive a share or not. So then you can actually measure other regarding preferences, altruism, fairness, all of those things, and whether it is reflective or not.
Yeah. So I will. I've been using the term ethics a bit loosely in this talk. Clearly, the economic games, generally, what we mean there is other regard. So do people seem to assign utility to fairness? So broadly speaking, when people are interacting with an agent, as opposed to, agent representing a person versus what they believe they're interacting with a person directly, they seem to show less other regards. If you know, like Fair and Schmidt stuff, I'm sure you do.
Yes.
Basically, it's, and actually we have a paper trying to use Fair and Schmidt, and it seems that when people interact with an agent, it's as if they show no guilt, or show much attenuated guilt. They still show envy to some extent, but it seems that those parameters are attenuated, and so it's probably best to look at those economic settings is more in line with the kind of Fair and Schmidt notion of other regard when I use the term ethics. And generally speaking, the more the other is less, the less salient the principle is, the less either side. Generally speaking, those parameters are attenuated, so it's as if they're assigning less weight to the goals and interests, particularly the guilt aspect of the interaction. And now the process control stuff, I mean, there we're using, that's coming from a different literature, and we're using terminology that seems more obviously associated with ethical behavior. So, you're telling, is it okay for this system to lie or steal or withhold information? And so I'm not sure how to directly capture, I haven't thought enough about how that directly maps over to the kind of standard notions of other regard, and I appreciate any thoughts anyone has on that point. And I can't answer the Guth stuff because I have to think about that more. Moral hazard, as I understand, it's more as people act unethically, that will tend to lead everyone to sort of act unethically. Is that not right?
Well, in a simple principal agent, we can just say moral hazard happens as a result of information asymmetry, so that the provider has a typical distribution of where the costs and benefits can be associated with the service that they are offering. And the agent has incentive, like in insurance market, to conceal that information in order to get a better deal.
Yeah.
We just put big names that have a lot of load on them when we are talking about cost-benefit analysis. But so specifically, if I don't even want to speak economic language, tell me, in your operationalization, is pro-sociality ethical or not? When you are measuring ethicality, and because you talked about both of these, and I'm...
Yeah, I guess in most of our work, I would say that ethicality is pro-sociality. So in the sense of pro-sociality means other regard. So
same construct is being measured.
Yeah.
And all on Likert scales. Everything on Likert scales.
Well, these are behavior, right? So do you give the fair offer or not, right?
Okay. Thank you. I'll send a reference to those papers if you want.
Yeah. I mean, in moral hazard, I've like thought through. I mean, the difference here is that this is your agent in a sense. It's initially, it wasn't obvious that the principal agent problem. I mean, usually that's in terms of when you try to translate over to computational systems, you think in terms of mechanism design, which I guess is in some sense what we're doing here. It's just that you're giving personal control over the mechanism in some sense, whereas often it's thought of as a third party in the AI world is establishing, provably fair or envy-free mechanisms. And so here we're saying that people can choose their own mechanism in a sense, but I think some of the constructs from principal agent theory apply and are relevant in that context as well.
Fair enough. Thank you very much.
Good point. Very thoughtful, and please send those references.
Definitely.
Other questions?
Thank you both. So let's open it up for others. Other questions?
Thank you, John, for this great talk. I had a question about the dictator game you used. When they are playing the dictator game with an algorithm or with an AI, who gets the payoffs, or what did you tell the participants who gets the payoffs? So I'm sort of, just intrigued by the thought of like whether the AI has any sort of utility and whether people represent it in any way. And so,
yeah, we played with different ways of doing that. Initially, we just sort of left it unspoken. Sometimes we measured it. We asked people, where does the money go? And in some cases, we've explicitly tried to manipulate it. So, for example, saying any money won by the computer will go to buying more computer equipment, like memory upgrades or something. I realize that in some sense that I'm not comfortable with that issue, which is sort of what pushed me into this whole world of focusing more on that the agent actually represents the interests of some other person. So I mean, it's, I think, kind of weird and hokey to do a game with just the computer because for that very question. But in the reality, the computer always is benefiting some organization or person. And so I think it's more natural, many of these studies, they just treat the computer as a thing unto itself, but that's never really the case. And so I think that part of the point of this talk is really to have people think, to encourage further people to think of this as just part of this ecosystem and not just an isolated entity, because that raises that question. Generally speaking, I think what we find when we measure it is that people who give money to the computer believe it's going to go to a person, and so that's why they give it.
Okay. Thank you.
Other questions?
Hi, John. This is Jason. I was wondering, at some point you mentioned that the be more delegate unpleasant task of blow to. And I was has this event performed, or is it no? Such technologies have been deployed at all?
I'm sorry, I'm not actually hearing you. You keep cutting out.
I'm having the same difficulty, but if I understood correctly, Jason is asking whether you're aware of products on the market that allow a manager to delegate to an agent some kind of interaction with basically people who report to them.
Yes.
Yes. Yes. I don't have specific names with me. I can track some of them. There's various, and it's generally, not an all-encompassing thing, but there's pieces of it. So definitely the monitoring aspect is very commonly delegated. And so there's software that will monitor employees, drivers, monitor them if you're a truck driver, and report autonomously back to the employee, to the manager. There's tools that try to solicit employee voice, and so they sometimes delegate that voice solicitation process to the manager. The argument made by those companies is that you'll get more truthful or honest information. And it's kind of like the call, if you have like an employee suggestion box, that's a very simple technology to delegate voice solicitation. There is, obviously systems like Uber, you're delegating tasking, higher incentives. You pre-program a policy as to whether to give additional bonuses to drivers for certain behavior or disincentives of certain. So the whole monitoring and compensation aspect is completely delegated in the sort of algorithmic management types of systems like Uber and Lyft. So, I think those are examples where we are seeing elements of the managerial process delegated.
So to follow up on that, I just wanted to ask if you've thought about a potentially positive use of this type of technology, in the sense that sometimes an employee may appreciate getting feedback from an agent rather than from a human manager, because the agent noticed my mistake, gave me feedback, but the boss doesn't know. So it's kind of between me and the AI, and I get an opportunity to fix things, and the manager gets only the like my monthly performance and so on. So people often talk negatively about algorithmic management, but this seems to me to be a more empowering, kind of more forgiving scenario.
Yeah, and I've actually run, what in analogy to the work on people more comfortable revealing negative things to an agent, my sense is there would be people are more comfortable receiving negative feedback from an agent as opposed to a person about their job performance. We've actually run about 15 studies trying to show that effect in different kinds of, basically looking at sort of crowd workers doing horrible tasks and then getting positive or negative feedback about their performance. We haven't, unfortunately, been able to show a strong effect in those lines of studies. It seems like the workers, there's just not an effect of, they don't like negative feedback, they like positive feedback. Their behavior doesn't seem to be strongly influenced, and they don't really care if it's from a human or computer. Now, these have all been online studies, and so the workers are actually very comfortable dealing with computers, because Mechanical Turk is basically they only deal with computers, and so that may be a contributing factor. So if we had like richer kinds of settings, but as of now, I believe that, but I've been unsuccessful trying to show that phenomenon.
Anyone else, or was it Jason you wanted to follow up as well?
I do have a follow-up question. This is Anne-Marie speaking. So regarding your observation that there were some changes since COVID-19, I found that really intriguing because I could see that with the situation and a platform like Mturk that is sort of collaborative, people try to help out more each other. But then the second observation that you seem to have made, that they discriminate less between human and artificial agents. That's really interesting. Do you think that this could be due to people sort of interacting less with other humans at this point of time and more with machines through machines? And also how do you make sure that we just don't have very different populations of M-Turkers working at this point of time? Like, do you actually have longitudinal data that would support this, or is it just like across studies?
Well, we've been only measuring COVID since COVID. So, I mean, we've been doing a number of studies throughout the COVID thing. It's not, I think, well, I mean, it's highly COVID score is highly correlated with what's called the cognitive reflection test. So it's people seem to be engaged in more heuristic thinking. They, in terms of, it's not just pro-sociality, but they seem to be less, well, not just human-computer, they sort of less discriminating in a variety of ways. So, for example, if you're a receiver in a trust game, there's kind of a general phenomenon of reciprocity. So the more someone trusts in you, the more you give back. People are less discriminating on that kind of reciprocity notion. So there's a whole number of different factors that they're less discriminating. Now, it could be that they're just, what we're seeing is the people that report they're high in COVID are just generally, maybe they're just economically motivated to get quickly through these studies. And they're just, we're in some sense seeing a different group of people. In general, I don't think it's just COVID. There's been a shift in a number of colleagues I work with are feeling that these online platforms are increasingly invaded by bots or other people that are just motivated to make as much money as possible. And so we often have, for example, open-ended comments where people can put in, and I'm starting to see things like people pasting in Wikipedia entries and just, I don't know if it's a human or they just wrote a bot to do that. So yeah, I think you have to be a little cautious in interpreting those findings, and we're not experimentally manipulating COVID, obviously. It's sort of a natural experiment. And we'll keep measuring this over time, but so many other factors are changing. So I think you're right to be cautious in interpreting what that means.
Thank you. Any other questions?
I think I see. Was it Subharati? You were going to come to USC, right?
Yes, that's true. That is, which is why actually I'm in the other department, other center in human development. I really wanted to be a part of this session. It's great to see you, and very nice talk, of course.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, on that very nice note, let me thank Jonathan again for presenting. I think we've learned a lot. I think there's a lot of synergy also between what Jonathan is doing and what we're pursuing here at the center. So I want everybody to join me in thanking him again, and would love to catch up again, perhaps on a follow-up call of some sort.
And I think there's there's some chat messages. I'm not sure if those get saved. But I guess I just want to make sure it doesn't disappear before.
Yeah, it probably would disappear. Yeah, I think this is Shabnam Joyce sharing the paper.
So I think I copied it. Let me just make sure. Yep, got it. Okay.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, and we hope to see you in Berlin at some point in person.
That would be nice.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks again, and have a good day. You're just starting your day. We're finishing up here. Okay.
All
Thanks
right.
everyone for attending. Have a good one. Bye-bye.
Bye.